But if we can have Mr. Aliu Seka, the CEO of GCCI, please take your seat. Can we give them a round of applause, please, as they're sitting down? Thank you. And if we can have Mr. Baima Disise, the Director of Budget at the Ministry of Finance, to please take your seat. Okay, thank you very much. I will now like to call upon our CEO, Mr. Kewo Adeneo, to deliver the welcome address.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for coming. It's going to be a short one from me, and then we'll go into the meat of the day. I would like to thank and acknowledge the presence of the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom. I acknowledge the presence of the resident rep of the IMF, who's also a panelist, country economist of the World Bank, CEO GCCI, Baima Disise, Director of Budget, thank you very much for coming. Our wonderful clients, thank you very much for coming. And other members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. The main essence of today, and I dare say that the event has come at a very, very great time. The main essence of today is to look at the plans of the country Gambia, the budget that has just been released, and what are the opportunities and what are the challenges. As you know, this is very critical because 2019, Thomas Cook threw us off completely. And we're praying that in 2020, COVID-19 or coronavirus, will not have a severe effect. So again, very important to look at what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. We have here, for the third year running, our economist looking after Africa and the Gambia, Emmanuel Kwapong. Thank you very much for coming. And we hope that it's going to be a very, very interactive session so that we challenge the panelists on stage, we challenge the economists, and we get the best out of today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for that welcome. My name is Mustafa John, I'm the head of corporate affairs and standard channel. I'll be double acting as your MC and your moderator today. So I would like to call upon Emmanuel Kwapong, our economist, to deliver his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for, as Kale said, the third in a series of sessions that we've been organizing over the last 3 years. For me, it's always a pleasure to come back to the Gambia, and rest assured, I have quickly gotten accustomed to the new greetings that has come about because of the coronavirus. Over the next couple of minutes, I will just basically share with you Standard Chartered Bank's view on the economic outlook for 2020. I will start with the global outlook and then dive into what we expect to happen in sub-Saharan Africa, finally coming to the Gambia to close the session. Very sorry that you can see the slides I presented, or I prepared for you, but I'll go ahead without it. Technical glitches do happen, and we've experienced one right now. So I'll just start with the global outlook. In December, we published our flagship annual economic report, as we do every year heading into a new year. And in that report, we were projecting the global growth will pick up slightly to about 3.3% this year, from about 3.1% we were projected for 2019. Now, since then, there's been quite a significant development, a black swan event, as they say in markets, of course, being the novel coronavirus that is currently spreading around the world. Because of that, we had to go back to look at our projections, and we've had to revise our 2020 growth forecast downwards. We now are projecting 3% growth for 2020 from the 3.3% we were projecting earlier. And that represents the slowest growth to the global economy that we've seen since the global financial crisis in 2008. So pretty significant downward revisions there. And that downward revision largely driven by our lowering our forecast for China GDP growth. We now expect China to grow at 5.5% this year from our initial 6.1 projections last year. The coronavirus, of course, has disrupted activities in China. We have the PMI print out for February already, showing that manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors witnessed significant contraction. In fact, the lowest contraction that we've seen on record since the PMI print started. A lot of sectors will be impacted, looking at construction, retail sales, real estate, across the board. And that's significant, particularly if you look at China's contribution to global growth between 38 to 40%, depending on which measure you use, i.e. PPP terms or nominal GDP terms. But it's not only China's growth that will revise downwards. The impact is beyond China. We have also lowered our forecast for two other major economies, the US by 0.1% and the Euro area by 0.2% as well, because of the soft activity in China, the weak demand from China for exports from the US and the Euro area will clearly be impacted. In addition, tourism will be impacted. Chinese tourists going into the US and the Euro area are quite significant. If you look at last year, we had 3 million Chinese visitors to the US, double that number to the Euro area. So that also will be impacted. Travel will be impacted. Airlines, US airlines will be impacted by that, because they usually carry about 40% of these tourists into China, into the US, sorry. So a broad-based slowdown that we are seeing as a result of the virus. As Standard Chartered, our core assumption is that this virus will be contained by the end of March. Of course, and that is what our projections are based on. Therefore, should it go on beyond that, then there will be further downside risks to our forecast. Furthermore, even beyond China and the US and the Euro area, back in Asia, out of China, you're going to also have disruptions to growth because of the supply chain disruptions, the connections or the integrations between other Asian economies and China. Tourism again will be affected in some of these economies. Thailand stands out to be one of the hardest users to the area. Again, commodity prices are being impacted. We've had base metal prices falling, copper down, iron ore down. We've had crude oil prices also being impacted. we've actually had to revise lower our Brent price forecast for 2020 as well. We were projecting an average price of $70 per barrel for 2020. We've now sent that down by $6 a barrel to about $64 average for the year. As I've said, we think that it's largely going to be contained to Q1, the first quarter of 2020. And so we do expect kind of a V-shaped recovery heading into the later part of the year. So that should support prices further. But what does all this mean, if I should say, for the economies of the major economies? How are they going to respond? Well, we expect that there will be some fiscal and monetary response across the world. Indeed, it's already happening on the monetary front. Just 2 days ago, on Tuesday, the U.S. Federal Reserve acted, surprised markets by cutting the federal funds rate by 50 basis points. The next day, the Bank of Canada also did say another 50 basis points cut. China has already implemented monetary stimulus. There's been some liquidity injections into the system. They have been given preferential rates to banks that lend to companies impacted by the coronavirus, and they stand ready to act should more be required. So we are seeing a concerted or coordinated global effort to tackle the issue. In the euro area, the ECB, or the European Central Bank, already has rates quite negative. So we think they are not really going to act now, but they will stand to act, and they could lower rates. They are already purchasing large-scale assets under the quantitative easing program, so there's room there as well to support growth. On the fiscal side as well, there are a lot of economists. Great, sorry. So we could now go through. Okay, thank you. So this is just showing what I was talking about, the response that we expect from the U.S. Central Bank. As a reminder to the U.S. Federal Reserve on Tuesday, we expect them to cut this month twice. We expect another 25 basis points in mid-March and another 35 basis points in April, all to support global growth. Moving to the next slide, just highlighting more on the fiscal front, the countries or major economies that have room for fiscal adjustments without necessarily impacting their areas significantly. So if you look at the euro area, there's a lot of room there to ramp up spending to support growth. Look at Australia and New Zealand as well, there's room there as well. And even in many markets, such as Korea, Malaysia, this time, we do see room for them to spend more basically to support growth. So can we move to the next slide? Yes, so supporting part of the growth down the line, which has been overshadowed by the coronavirus, has been the U.S.-China trade deal, the phase one trade deal that was achieved later last year. And that was supposed to support most confidence and trade within the region. That is still on the table, and that should come in as a positive for global growth going forward. But what does all this mean for Sub-Saharan Africa, if I should ask? Can we please move on to the next two slides? So the region has really been experiencing or has been underperforming global growth at least since 2014, following the collapse in commodity prices in late 2014. 2020 could be the first year the region actually outperforms global growth. But this picture hides what really is hiding underneath. If you move to the next slide, you see that it's largely being driven by weaknesses in growth in the two major economies in the region, Nigeria and South Africa, which together, have an outsized impact on the region's growth, accounting for more than half of the region's GDP. In Nigeria's case, it's still on the recovery trajectory following the impact of global oil prices. In South Africa, having issues, particularly in the electricity side, electricity supply with Eskom, but also other structural issues that are confidence and investment in the country. Beyond these two economies, as you see on the next slide, the story is quite rather interesting. There are a lot of other countries that are really going quite strong in the region. We are having countries going 7% plus, 6% plus in West Africa and in East Africa. The likes of Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, they have had strong sustained growth over the last couple of years. In East Africa, the likes of Ethiopia, even in Tanzania, seeing robust growth. In 2020, our projections for growth is also shown there. So the deeper blue colors are regions where we are expecting much stronger growth. The lighter ones, less so. Again, in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and right in the Ghana, strong growth of 6% plus. In Uganda as well, and Kenya. So it's more that see that global inquiry across for just two major economies which have an outside impact on the region's overall growth. Now, if we move to the next slide, we have undertaken research within our department, or the research department of financial research, that show that economies that grow at 7% or more for at least a decade would have their economy double over that 10-year period. Significant. If you're able to do that, you can just double your economy in 10 years. And there are countries that have done that. We've had those, the Asian giants, Asian tigers, having done that. Currently, we were looking for candidates in Africa who qualify to be part of that 7% club. And only two economies currently are on our radar. We have Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire, who really qualify for that. The rest are mainly based in Asia. Going to the next slide, where we are zooming in on the impact of coronavirus on the region as a whole. We looked at the channels through which coronavirus likely impact the sub-Saharan Africa region. One of that where we looked at was trade and particularly commodity prices. China is now the most important trade partner to the region, except the EU, and so that has significant implications for trade. Again, commodity prices are being impacted because China is a major demand market for commodity prices. We do expect a contraction in Chinese imports for the January-February period, and indeed for Q1 because of the restrictions that were put in place, the delay to the resumption of production following the New Year holidays, among other things. And the data is already showing that. We look at countries that are most likely to be hit hard, those that are major commodity exporters, particularly base metals or oil exporters, and that export a significant proportion of their products to China. And a couple of countries stood out in that case. Angola was top because of its high exports to China. It will be hit on the trade side, but also it will be hit on commodity prices side because of lower oil prices. Congo as well, another oil exporter, Gabon oil exporter. Zambia, copper exporter, also going to be hit. So it's a broad-based impact across the region. Moving to the next slide as well, another channel we're looking at was tourism, and that of course is very important for the Gambia. We looked at Chinese tourists into the region and which countries have quite a significant proportion of that. And we found across the region, actually, the Chinese tourists are not that significant in terms of the numbers compared to tourists from other regions. So that really is going to have a limited impact on tourism in sub-Saharan Africa. But now the virus is also spreading to Europe and more recently in America. And so these are other markets for which tourists do come from. And so that we are watching that. Our base case remains that the virus is limited to Q1 2020, and so should have a very limited impact on tourism as a whole for the region. Again, tourism as a share of the region's GDP, just about 3%. So the impact will probably be limited from our perspective. Moving to the next slide, we also looked at what kind of response the governments across the region could have in terms of responding to the coronavirus. When I talked about the major economies and how they were responding through fiscal policy and monetary policy loosening, we also did say for Sub-Saharan Africa. On the fiscal front, we saw that there was very little room for governments to ramp up spending across the region. Debt levels have risen quite significantly, and there's a need for fiscal consolidation. That is narrowing the gap between expenditure and revenue to ensure that debt levels remain sustainable. So not many governments have the room to spend more in response to the coronavirus, should that be needed. On the monetary front as well, on the next slide, we haven't really seen the dovish wave. There haven't really been easing in interest rates across the region, largely because inflation hasn't really dropped off significantly. So again, not much room for governments to respond on the monetary front as well. Moving to the next slide, we also look at countries that are exposed to changes in risk aversion. Currently, because of the concerns around the coronavirus outbreak, we are seeing, a hit to risk aversion. People or investors are becoming more cautious, and emerging market economies could suffer. We looked at countries that have a high proportion of foreigners holding local currency debt because they are vulnerable to sudden stops and capital flow reversals. And this, of course, will have significant impact for their FX or the stability of the currency. And you look at South Africa stands out, but Ghana, Nigeria also having quite significant foreign portfolio flows. Now, finally, moving to the Gambia. The next slide, please. The Gambian economy has actually been doing quite well over the last couple of years. I'm sure you're all aware of the growth that has been achieved. We've had growth recover from the lows in 2016, and that has largely been driven by the services sector. Looking at the chart on the left, you see that that recovery mainly services-led. We looking further into what really is driving services growth. You see a clear contribution from trade. Trade, of course, accounting for more than half of the entire services growth, so it's quite significant, followed by transport, communications, and hospitality. At Standard Chartered, we think that growth will remain around the 6% region in the medium term. If you move to the next slide, we have some of our forecasts there. In 2020, we are projecting that the economy will grow at about 6.2% this year, and that is really being driven by the services sector. It's going to continue to be services-led. The same candidates, trade will remain strong in our view, but also tourism will continue to pick up as the sector is becoming more competitive. We're seeing more tourist arrivals. We've seen the latest data from the central bank showing resilient tourist arrivals at least in the year of the end. So despite the hiccup in November from the Thomas Cook collapse, we have seen a pickup again, and it's still robust, helped in part by the increasing flight arrivals that we've had by other operators. So tourism still will remain robust. The services sector as a whole will be continuing to drive growth for the Gambian economy. We also assume favorable weather, and that is, of course, very important for agriculture. We think agricultural growth will be strong, particularly given the weak or the disappointing agricultural output we saw last year. On the demand side of it, we think we're going to still get strong growth from investment, partly driven by public investment, to be specific, under the National Development Plan. But also consumption should also remain robust. We have had a 50% increase in public sector wages in 2019. Inflation still remains relatively low. So real household income should benefit again from the growth that we are seeing in the economy. That should also help the consumption sector, or consumption demand, if I should say. There's also monetary policy easing that has been going on, a very loose monetary policy regime supporting credit growth and private sector activity. So in all, we think that these factors should be able to support growth of about 6.2% this year. if you move to the next slide, which just shows the resilience we've seen in the tourist arrivals. This is data from the CBG. You look at previous shocks to the tourist sector. Of course, the Ebola outbreak, which really did not impact this country, but had the most significant shock on tourist arrivals from the 2014 period there. We also had the political impasse in 2016, a bit of a blip. But you look at 2019, you do see a break, a structural shift in terms of tourist arrivals, really strong growth there. And we also looked at the Thomas Cook shock. Hasn't really been much of a shock, as you can see. It has been a bit of a blip, but still really strong. Compared to previous shocks, this has had a very limited impact on the tourist sector. Sorry. On the fiscal front as well, of course, debt sustainability remains the key focus. The Gambia has had quite high debt levels, about 87%, that's at 2018, quite significant debt service ratios, pretty high, and this has really brought the debt sustainability to question and required that the authorities undertake quite significant fiscal adjustments. If you look across the region in sub-Saharan Africa, fiscal adjustments has usually been, or fiscal consolidation has usually been, negative for growth because it's largely been expenditure cuts rather than revenue mobilization measures. So governments have tried to raise revenues but have had limited successes there. So they've had to respond to cut expenditure to narrow that gap between revenue and expenditure. And usually it's capital expenditure that suffers the most. Current expenditure is more difficult to cut. You're not going to make many friends if you cut public sector wages. So it's a tough one to sell. And when capital expenditure is cut, investment is hit. And so usually you see that negative drag on growth because of fiscal consolidation measures. In the Gambia's case, it stands out in that it's been more growth friendly. And how has this been achieved? If you look at the chart on the left side, you see that there is grants which have risen quite significantly, so significant support from development partners helping to ensure that. We've also had a lot done in terms of revenue mobilization in the last 2 or 3 years. You see revenue mobilization also picked up. So it stands out in that sense. The revenue has picked up, but grants have also picked up quite significantly. So it's allowed or created a fiscal space for expenditure to remain relatively where it's been over the years. You've had wage increases, as I alluded to, capital expenditure still strong. And so it's more growth friendly relative to other fiscal consolidation measures that we've had. But still, even with fiscal consolidation, that wasn't going to be enough to return the debt to sustainable levels, given how high the debt ratio was and how large debt service cost was a drag on revenue. So what needed to be done was to get some restructuring of some of this debt, deferral of some of the payments, to create some fiscal space and give the government room, to really support future growth in revenue. And thankfully, we just heard that has been achieved. The authorities have agreed some debt restructuring with some of the external creditors, creating some fiscal space for them, but more importantly, making debt or taking the Gambia out of debt distress. And that's important because for the Gambia to qualify for an IMF-funded program, it was important that the Gambia moved out of debt distress. With that now, there is a staff-level agreement between the IMF and the Gambia for a funded program. Hopefully the executive board will be meeting and approving that shortly, and that should also unlock further concessional financing to the Gambia, but more importantly, anchor the reform drive or the reform momentum that we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly heading into elections. On the next slide, we also looked at monetary policy and on the monetary front as well. inflation particularly has been well behaved as benign inflation outlook. So we did see some pickup in inflation pressures in 2019, following the disinflationary trend we saw in 2018, and this largely or partly has been because of higher food prices. If you look at the chart on the left, shows you a headline CPI on one print, but also food CPI on the other. So you do see quite a significant uptake in food pressures. Comes back to the disappointing agricultural output we saw last year, and that was feeding through to higher prices. We think that inflation should be more behaved in 2020. We expect inflation to average about 6.1% this year from the 7.1% it averaged last year. And based on that, in December, we were calling or forecasting that the central bank will cut the policy rate, or had room to cut the policy rate by about 50 basis points. In February, the central bank did just that, cutting policy rate by 50 basis points in line with our expectations. Again, that should be supportive for growth. But that brings the total amount of easing or monetary easing under the current easing cycle that started in February 2017, 2 years ago, to over 1,000 basis points. That is the chart on the right. It shows the central bank policy rate, 23% high in 2017. It's come all the way down to 12% now in 2020. So quite significant easing, and that should support credit growth, which already has recovered quite significantly. Moving to the external sector, or the external sector as well, we've seen improvements there in terms of the external position, in terms of reserves particularly. Sorry, the next slide. So yes, the current account deficit remains large, but we've also had significant capital inflows. And so that really has helped in terms of the buildup of FX reserves, which are now at their highest since at least 2004. And that has supported the Dalasi FX stability, relative stability in the Dalasi we experienced in 2019, in 2020 as well. We do not expect any significant FX pressures. We expect the Dalasi to remain relatively stable. We are continuing to look at developments regarding the coronavirus. For now, we think that it will have very limited impact on the Gambia. As I said, our view is that it's going to be contained by March. That remains our core scenario. Should that not happen, then we'll revisit our projections and see what that means. Containing by March means that by the start of the next tourist season in October, that should not be a drag on growth. That currently remains our view on the Gambia. So just to summarize all in three key points. Global growth, yes, it's slowing because of the impact of coronavirus. We do expect it to be limited to Q1. We are going to see contraction in Q1, weaker growth in Q1, but we expect a V-shaped recovery from Q2 to Q3 onwards. That should support growth. And Sub-Saharan Africa, we think that will probably be a limited impact on the region as a whole. Usually, the region experiences the impact of growth in Sub-Saharan Africa slows down with a lag compared to other regions because of the structure of the economy in most of these regions. This could be more immediate, but we think it's still going to be limited. In the Gambia, we see the outlook as continuing to be positive. We do expect growth of around 6%. Of course, the challenge for the government will remain how to achieve sustained growth over the longer term. For now, it's more of a cyclical, but we would want to have more structural long-term growth. I talked about the research we have done that showed that to double your economy in 10 years, you need to grow at about 7% on a sustained basis. So that will be a challenge for the government to achieve, sustaining high growth rates or robust growth rates over the longer term, and not just a medium-term phenomenon. Again, beyond growth, sustaining growth, it has also to be inclusive, because if you have high growth and it's just not inclusive, you still have unemployment rates that are still high, then that becomes another challenge. So that needs to be also more inclusive growth, and that will require more structural reforms that address the bottlenecks in the system, and that give the skills that is needed to meet the demands of businesses that come as a result of the two structural changes. So three key things, to summarize the slides. Thank you.
My immediate right, we have Mr. Mamadou Julde Diallo. Mr. Mamadou Julde Diallo, he's the current president representative of the World Bank. Mr. Barry also attended the Central Bank meeting before joining the IMF as president representative as an economist in 2002 right up to 2008. He returned to the government as assistant to the Ministry of Economic and Finance in 2010 until his appointment as a special appointee at the IMF headquarters in 2013, working on a year later, he was recruited as an IMF economist where he rose to the position of senior economist working successively in Niger and in Cameroon. He became the IMF representative to the Gambia in August 2019. Mr. Barry holds an associate degree in mathematics and physics from Morocco, a Master's of Arts degree in economics and statistics from Ivory Coast, and another Master's of Arts in economics policy from William College in the USA. Our next panelist is Mehwish Ashraf. Mehwish Ashraf is the country economist for the World Bank in the Gambia. She is a Pakistani national. Ashraf joined the World Bank Pakistan office in 2011 as a consultant. Since then, she held various positions in the World Bank, including an assignment as a country economist in Pakistan. She has led substantial analytical work on micro-physical issues and was instrumental in developing substantial debt program in Pakistan at the national and subnational level. Her regional experience include working in the Maldives, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and in Nepal. Prior to joining the bank, she worked at the debt office at the Ministry of Finance, Government of Pakistan, and Ashraf holds a master's degree in business administration from Quad El Azam University in Islamabad, Pakistan. And to follow on that, we have Mr. Aliu Seka, who is the current CEO of the Gambia Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Mr. Seka studied corporate governance and finance in London. He is a fellow of the UK Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, fellow of Chartered Management Institute, fellow member of Association of Accounting Technicians, and studied hospitality general management at Cornell University in the USA. He has worked in auditing, accounting, hospitality, strategy, corporate administration, and has championed momentous transformations in the private sector for the last 20 years. Prominent among them is leadership and positive advocacy in public-private dialogue, and also in the tourism industry. He has invested and served as the chairman of the Gambia Hotel Association, National Enterprise Development Initiative, Africa Travel Association, Director of Labor Advisory Board, and of course he worked as a director at Reliance Financial Services as well. Mr. Seka is also a board member or a board director at the Gambia Ports Authority, Social Development Fund, Gambia Public Works Agency, Drug Law Enforcement Agency of the Gambia, She Trades Advisory Board, and Champions Review Board, Complaints Review Board. He is a social entrepreneur, an active Rotarian, a past president of Rotary and District Treasury in West Africa, as well as the Honorary Consul of Indonesia in the Gambia. You're welcome. And finally, we have Mr. Baima Sise, who is the Director of Budget at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, a post he has held since 2015. In his current role, he coordinates the formulation and execution of government's annual budget. In addition, he also doubles as the National Designated Authority, NDA, to the Green Climate Fund, GCF, which is the biggest multilateral climate change fund in the world. As the NDA to the GCF, he mainly serves as the interface between the country and the GCF, especially when project proposals are to be submitted to the GCF for funding consideration. Prior to his redeployment as the Director of Budget at the Ministry, Mr. Cisse served as a Director of Public Management Reform at the same Ministry, where he coordinates the implementation of government PMF reforms. You're all welcome. So we'll now move into the interactive session. So what I would like to do now is to call upon Mr. Barry to give an overview from the World Bank's IMF perspective, the economic outlook of the Gambia, and also to highlight the opportunities and, of course, the challenges that he feels the Gambia faces. We have a microphone next to you, so all you need to do is to switch it on and give us your overview. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John, and I would like to welcome you all and to say that I'm very pleased to be here this morning. And thank to KO for inviting me, making the IMF part of this event. I would also like to thank Emmanuel, the presenter. I think what I didn't plan here to come and talk about the outlook because I knew that Mr. Emmanuel will elaborate on that. I think what he said about the Gambia and also about the global economy is reflective to what our thinking is at the IMF. So I will not restate what he has said. I think if there is a specific question during the interaction that is needed for me, I will be able to answer to those questions. What I did instead is to give you an overview of what the IMF have been doing into the Gambia recently and where we stand with the program that everyone has been hearing about for the last, I think, 3 years. As you may recall, in February, during February 3rd and 11th, we had the IMF mission that visited the Gambia to assess first the government performance under the 2019 SMP, but also to agree on the set of policies that will underpin the government request for a 3-year program with the Gambia, with the IMF, sorry. The amount of that program will be about $48 million from the IMF over the 3 years, but at the same time, that financing will leverage additional funding from our key partners that are the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Union in the form of budget support of around 150 to 200 million. The package of that program have been cleared by our management. The authorities have signed the letter of intent of the program, and right now all the packages have been submitted to our board for consideration in the next few weeks. We expect that by the end of this month, the program will be approved. This was possible because Gambia demonstrated a good track record under the SMP by meeting the target that were set under that program, but also advancing the structural reform that the IMF expected the Gambia to implement during 2019. I will say all the reforms that were in the SMP were completed by the end of 2019. For example, the GRA did an excellent performance in 2019 with additional 1 percentage point of GDP of tax revenue collected compared to 2018. So it's a significant, you rarely see that kind of performance in a year. The government also recorded additional revenue that were not expected into the program of about 15 million from the prospecting oil companies. So that also was in addition to what the performance of the GRA. We'll say also the budget, 2020 budget, was discussed by the IMF, and that budget will be the basis of our program and is anchored in achieving fiscal sustainability. Another important point that was achieved by the authority was their ability to secure debt service deferral from the main creditors, which has markedly improved the country's debt outlook and enabled the Gambia to exit from its situation of debt distress. That said, the risk of debt distress is still high, but they are not in debt distress as a result of that deferral that the country were able to benefit. That debt deferral will create a space of about 160 million US dollars in the next 5 to 7 years, which could be used to address the country social and infrastructural need. The main objective of that program will be to enhance economic growth, support job creation, but also reduce poverty in line with meeting the objective of the National Development Plan, but also the Sustainable Development Goal in partnership with our partners, such as the World Bank, the UN agencies, and all the development partners in the Gambia. The program also will help strengthen revenue mobilization, so to continue the effort of GRA in mobilizing additional resources, because our emphasis in reducing debt in the Gambia is not to cut spending, but rather to improve revenue collection and also improve the efficiency of spending. And we will achieve efficiency of spending by reforming better procurement. We have the Procurement Act that have been submitted to, a new Procurement Act that have been submitted to Cabinet. I think my colleague from the World Bank will be able to talk about it. But also we'll improve project selection and cash management. This is to help contain the deficit and contain external borrowing and domestic borrowing, so that by the end of the program, the Gambia debt level can come to a sustainable, to be sustainable by the end of the program. We will also support the central bank effort in fostering financial sector stability and financial inclusion. As you know, financial inclusion is very important for growth, but also for poverty reduction. With the rapid increase in subsidies and transfer that we have observed over the years, we will also emphasize in reinforcing governance and the financial situation of subvented agencies and the SOEs. And on the SOEs, we will build on the audit that Ernest Young have conducted in all the SOEs in the Gambia. So as I said, on the outlook, we have the same growth, 6.3. We think the growth in 2020 will be supported by the tourist, the expanding tourist sector. The construction sector also will be a key driver of the outlook in 2020 because of the OIC projects that are ongoing and a lot of road construction that are ongoing inside the country. We have also the diaspora-led real estate boom that also we are observing through these remittances that we observe every year in the Gambia. So that also will contribute to the outlook. We expect, as he said, that primary sector, which declined by 10% in 2019, will partly recover in 2020. So we will see a positive agricultural growth in 2020. However, with the spread of the coronavirus, this outlook could change, and we are presently working in opting our global outlook, but also the outlook of each country based on different scenarios that we have been provided. So we are doing that exercise. We hope it will be completed by the end of the week. But what is good to notice that our management have declared yesterday that they have mobilized substantial resources that are ready to be deployed to countries that will be affected by the coronavirus. So there is a international solidarity in the response to be provided by to support countries that will be victim of the coronavirus. So I will stop here and thank you all. If there is a question, I will be happy to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Barry, for giving that good overview, and of course what the World Bank is looking to see in the Gambia. And it's great to see that something is being mobilized in the event that the coronavirus do get in. So I would now like to call upon Mr. Baimadi Sise, the Director of Budget at the Ministry of Finance, to actually give an overview of the budget and what it hopes to achieve in the Gambia. But would also like you to draw upon the fiscal policies that you have within the budget and what it would do for the private sector, and of course the challenges you have with those fiscal policies as well. You have the floor, Mr. Sise.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My fellow panelists, the IMF resident rep, World Bank country economist, and the CEO of GCCI, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, good morning to you all. Let me first start with the 2020 budget. I will say that the 2020 budget is primarily anchored on two pillars. First, the issue of debt sustainability, which was already highlighted by the Standard Chartered Bank economist, and two, the provision of social services. Let me first address the issue of debt sustainability. Yes, as you rightly pointed, as you rightly pointed out, the debt situation is currently the biggest macroeconomic challenge that we face as a nation. There's no doubt about it. It has so many implications on the economy as a whole. For example, the crowding out of also the negative impact it has on the interest rates as well. But most critically, the more debt you accrue, the more you have to service your debt. And that means you have to divert critical resources from critical sectors, health, agriculture, and put them into debt service. So really, in a nutshell, the debt situation is quite worrisome. However, from a historical perspective, if you look at what's been happening from 2015 to date, the Gambia has made enormous progress. For example, in 2015, the total debt as a percentage of GDP was roughly around 110%, which was among the highest in Africa. Moved to 2018, as you rightly pointed out, it went down to about 87% of GDP. If you go further to 2019 last year, it went further down to 81% of GDP. And our target this year in 2020 is to get it to 76% of GDP. In the medium term, our target by 2024 is to get it to 60% of GDP. So really, we are on a very good trajectory. As the IMF President Rep said, we are no longer in debt distress, but the risks are still there, however. So specifically, what have we been doing with regards to this debt situation? Let me first start with the domestic debt component. What we've done with the domestic debt, first, we try to see how best to restructure the domestic debt, basically by introducing medium-term bonds rather than focusing on short-term debt instruments, 90-day, 180-day T-bills, and 360 days. Now we have 3-year bonds, we have 5-year bonds, and we have 7-year bonds as well too. And the primary reason we've done that is because we want to reduce the risk of the rollover debt servicing, rollover risk basically. In terms of the external component, what we've done, I think the IMF president alluded to one of it, which is the fact that we engage our creditors, especially our Arab creditors. I mean here the Islamic Development Bank, Kuwait Fund, Abu Dhabi Fund, Badia and the like, to see how best we can restructure the debt and get some debt deferral for a period of 5 years. And I'm happy to announce that this has been approved, and $25 million alone will be saved in the 2020 budget, which is quite significant. Another step also we've taken with regards to the 2020, with regards to external debt, we've also committed ourselves to basically accessing credit that has the minimum of 35% grant. This is the agreement that we have with the IMF. This will definitely reduce future debt service burden in the country. So this is what we've been doing with regards to the debt equation. But again, the primary element of dealing with debt is about discipline, fiscal discipline. And that maybe I'll expand on that a little bit later. But that also we've made some meaningful progress over the years. Now, on the issue of the social service of this 2020 budget, what we want to do, we want to focus more on the social service sector. And we have a lot of new initiatives on this 2020 budget, and we also have existing initiatives that we're expanding upon. For example, on the new initiatives, now on this 2020 budget, we have what we call a National Health Insurance Scheme. This is the first time we're having this. Basically, the objective is to try and give medical insurance coverage to the most vulnerable and also to civil servants. This will be basically applied in a gradual and phased manner. The initial target is just the most vulnerable and civil servants, but eventually we want to cover the entire country in the medium term. Another new initiative that we have is called the Program for Accelerated Community Development. This is a complete, by the way, for the health insurance scheme, government is putting a seed money of $100 million as a seed money. Now, the other new initiative is called the Program for Accelerated Community Development. This is also a new initiative, and government is currently putting $250 million in this initiative. What this initiative is about is basically look at what are some of the impediments of rural development in this country, especially when it comes to basic social services. I'm talking about maybe access to water, I'm talking about hygiene issues, I'm talking about transportation, good road networks, energy, and the like. And then see how best to address this in an accelerated manner. We'll be working with the UNDP, even though the project is fully funded by government. The entire $250 million is coming from government. Another initiative we have on this 2020 budget too is called what we call the Social Safety Net Project. This project is being implemented jointly with the World Bank. The Gambia government is putting in $10 million in. What this project is doing is basically giving out cash transfers to the most vulnerable people of society. Another initiative as well is to do with the school improvement grant. The reason why public education is free of charge in this country is because we have a grant called the SIG, which is $240 million that we give out to public schools. And then in turn, they will not charge students tuition fees. They will use this $240 million for their basic operations and also to buy books for the students, which is why public education is free of charge. And we have more than 1,000 public schools in this country. We also have what we call free examination fees. We also pay $45 million to WAEC, West Africa Examination Council, on an annual basis so that it will cover all the examination fees for the students. Is it the Gabiki examinations or WAS examinations? Another initiative we also have is called Open Scholarship, which this time we're putting around $85 million on Open Scholarship. This is basically to give scholarships to students to further their education, either domestically at the UTG Gambia College or externally in Mauritius, Morocco, India, and the like. We've put $85 million on this budget. Another good initiative we also have is called the school feeding program, whereby meals are being prepared for kids going to school. This used to be taken care of by the World Food Program, but now government is gradually taking it over from them. This year we put another last year we put $90 million in. This year we've also put another $90 million in. Another good social initiative also is to do with the issue of drugs in this country, the purchase of drugs to distribute to the hospitals. We also put another $120 million on the budget just strictly for the purchase of drugs. But this excludes the Global Fund intervention in terms of malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV. So in a nutshell, these are just some of the social initiatives that government is trying to focus on the 2020 budget. And quickly, just to give you a quick perspective with regards to expenditure and revenue, for expenditure, government is going to be putting the most amount of resources in the education sector. The budget for the education sector is about $2.5 billion, followed by the budget of the Ministry of Health, which is about $1.5 billion, followed by the Ministry of Interior, which is about $1 billion. This is just looking at it from government intervention. But if you're looking at it from all funds, including loans and grants that are coming from our respective development partners, then the ministry with the highest budget is the Ministry of Works and Infrastructure. They have a budget of about $4.1 billion. It's mainly about road construction. Followed by the Ministry of Education, about $3.6 billion, followed by the Ministry of Agriculture, $2.5 billion, and followed by the Ministry of Health, $2.1 billion. So in a nutshell, for the revenue perspective, we're expecting about $24 billion in revenue. The bulk of it is coming from tax revenue, about $11 billion, $2 billion for non-tax revenue, $8.1 billion for project grants, and finally $2.7 billion for budget support. Now, quickly, let me address your question with regards to some of the challenges and also some of the opportunities. For the opportunities, I'll mention two key points because this is the private sector forum as well too. I'll mention the issue of taxation, which is a very difficult and complex area. But I'd like to highlight, first of all, one thing. If you do not have good tax policies, your economy will never grow. We all know that. And then I will refer to the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, just to show you the progress we've made in terms of taxation. By the way, this Ease of Doing Business report is an independent report produced by the World Bank. The 2014 report, on one of the indicators, which is a key indicator, which is tax paid as a percentage of your profit. The number was 280%. That's how much government businesses were paying, as far as the profits are concerned. So in a nutshell, what that means is that if as a businessman, I make $1 million in profit at the end of the year, I've paid $3.8 million in taxes, both local and also central government taxes. That is quite high. And it's really unreasonable. So we looked at it, we say we have to do something about it. And we looked at three main tax components that are really affecting the private sector. We looked at the corporate tax, because this thing has a direct impact on your profitability and also your ability to expand as a business. We also looked at VAT, because this also affects your consumption levels. And finally, we also looked at personal income tax, because this has the direct bearing on your disposable income as well too, and also aggregate demand. So what we did with regards to personal income tax first, we went from 35%. We gradually started reducing it from 35 to 33 to 30, and now we are at 27%, which is the lowest in the region with the exception of Guinea-Bissau. We look at also personal income tax. What we did there, we increased the tax-free threshold from 18,000 to 24,000, meaning anybody making anything less than 24,000, you pay no personal income tax. In addition to that also, we looked at the highest bracket, which was 30%. We reduced it further to 25%, because our personal income tax regime is quite progressive, meaning that the more you earn, the more you're taxed. So each bracket, we reduce it also by 5%. And finally, for VAT, we retained the 15%. We didn't do anything with the VAT, it's still the same. But I'm happy to announce today, in 2014, as I said, this indicator, which highlighted that the Gambian businesses were paying 280% of taxes from their profits. In 2019, this figure has gone down to 50%, from 280 to 50% in just 5 years. And I think that it's very commendable, and it's a step in the right direction. I'm not saying that we still don't have challenges in taxation. Taxation is a very difficult and complex issue. Again, especially for a country like Gambia, whereby you have to balance the need to mobilize resources, because the Gambian economy is tax-based, but also you have to bear in mind economic growth as well too. So balancing these two acts is not an easy task. The other issue also with regards to how we're also trying to assist the private sector is with regards to credit expansion to the private sector. This is also quite important. For 2 years running now, credit expansion to the private sector has gone beyond 30%. This year, in 2019, it was about 35%, 2018 about 31%. This is also quite commendable. And what we're doing specifically is fiscal authorities are really taking charge. What are we doing? We're looking at it from two perspectives. How to implement prudent fiscal policies, number one, and number two, how to instill more discipline in terms of fiscal discipline. And if you look at these two areas, I would just like to highlight 2018. What was our fiscal deficit? It was at 6.2% of GDP in 2018. In 2019, we brought that down to 2.6% of GDP in just 1 year. And if you look at also the historical perspective, in terms of our net domestic borrowing, previously in, let's say, 2015, 2016, we're borrowing as much as 4.5 billion every year on the domestic market, mainly in the issuance of treasury bills. Today, that number has drastically gone down to less than $1 billion. And as a result, what is happening now? Private sector, especially commercial banks now, have to also adjust to this. And they have to, as a result, they have to diversify their portfolio, whereby now instead of just buying government treasury bills, they're also giving loans to the private sector, which is why these loans to the private sector have drastically increased by more than 35%. And we need this. Private sector need credit in order for them to expand their businesses. So really, this is also a step in the right direction. In terms of challenges, maybe I'll just highlight two or three challenges. The first one had been mentioned by the Standard Bank economist, which is the issue of inclusive growth. And I completely agree with you. That's a very valid point. You mentioned that the economy is growing by 6%, which is true. It's growing by 6%. But the question is this growth really filtering down to where it is needed the most, especially the poor and the most vulnerable? And what the statistics is showing is that if you look at our the GBOS statistics, it's saying that more than 40% of the population are living on less than $1.25 a day. But the bulk of this 40% are living in rural areas, which means that this growth, is it really filtering down to the poor? So that's the big question to be asked, which is why our strategy is to try and invest more into the social sector, which is why this 2020 budget is trying to address social development and also rural development as well too. The other issue with regards to challenge is to do with the strategic allocation of resources. This is extremely important because as a government, you can spend $100 billion, but if you don't channel it in the right place, you will not attain any meaningful development at the end of the year. Which is why I'm happy to say that we're working with the IMF to work on structural reforms, because you need to implement structural reforms, create the necessary fiscal space, and divert it into the meaningful, productive, and social sectors. If you look at our NDP, for example, it is very heavy on investment, capital investment. But if you look at the budget, on the other hand, it's more recurrent. So you see that there's a disjoint between what the NDP is talking about and what the budget is saying. So we need to close that disjoint by looking at by implementing structural reforms, creating the necessary fiscal space, and invest it into the meaningful sectors, productive and social, whereby you'll have impact on the most vulnerable and also the poor, and also lead to economic growth as well too. And the final point I will raise, is also about efficiency. Because yes, you can allocate your resources strategically, but you also must do it in an efficient manner in terms of getting value for money. And he mentioned the issue of public procurement, and I completely agree. It has been a challenge for government, and it's still a challenge. Government is basically paying above market value on almost every goods and services that we procure. So it has been a challenge. In 2014, we tried to address this challenge by amending the Public Procurement Act. We focused on three elements: separating the regulatory and policy function of GPPA, whereby they will not have to act as a judge and a jury at the same time. We also introduced the Independent Complaints Review Board, whereby vendors can lodge their appeal or complain if they think that they might have been wrongfully punished. And third, to also strengthen the definition of sanctions on the Act. We did all this, but still, public procurement, I have to say, remains a challenge in this country. And the final point is regards to M&E when it comes to operational efficiency. We also need to do more when it comes to monitoring how these resources are being utilized. It's one thing to give money to the sector, but it's another thing to also go on the site and visit and see how these resources are being utilized. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cisse. That was an excellent contribution. He has highlighted the focus areas being national debt at 110% and has come down significantly, access to credit, and of course, focus on social sciences as well. The opportunities, taxation, and of course, access to credit. And challenges look at inclusive growth, strategic allocation of resources, and efficiency. I'm sure the audience would have some questions for you regarding that. So now we would move on to our next panelist, Mr. Aliou Seka. The GCCI primarily represents the private sector, and clearly they are there to ensure they have good services and of course have informed information when it comes to ventures. So we would really like to hear your perspective of the economic outlook, especially what's in it for the private sector.
Thank you, Mustafa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, well, I am at ease that I'm in good company this morning because you all, or most of you, appreciate the issues that we are talking about, but also having had the perspective of the Standard Chartered Bank economists. So really, since there are no novices and we've had some of the issues that are cross-cutting, I will try to bring a kind of private sector perspective and a more practical way to issues. Clearly, we have many challenges to grapple with, but these also create opportunities for many of our members at the Gambia Chamber of Commerce. Therefore, we appreciate the opportunity that Standard Chartered Bank brings in for us all to come meet and hear and share some of these issues. Many of us are also familiar with a common adage, small is beautiful, but we also recognize that it also brings the challenge of productivity and economies of scale. But let me talk about a few facts that may have been also touched on by previous speakers. Yes, our GDP fell from 6.6% in 2018 to 5.4% in 2019. And this is as a result of weak fiscal policies and delays in budget support. Our exchange rate has also been relatively stable, but mainly because of remittances and also private and capital flows that have come from the diaspora. The World Bank highlights key long-term development challenges facing the Gambia, also related to our undiversified economy, weak governance framework, and the high population growth and lack of sufficient job creation by the private sector. As Madi has also indicated, we need to do better on our doing business ranking for the Gambia. We actually fell from 155 out of 190 countries. Well, actually, we're scoring now 155, when in 2018 we were at 149. So we need a lot more work to do and contain this growth. Agriculture, despite its potential, has not contributed much to poverty reduction as well, despite about 90% of our population being engaged in this. And this is mainly due to the reliance on rain-fed agriculture and post-harvest losses, weak value chains, and lack of packaging, and highly mechanized agricultural industries. As in many African countries, a reliable energy supply is also one of the urgent challenges that we must deal with. Only just half the population have a reliable access to electricity, with demand higher than capacity and installed capacity of with only half the population with access to electricity. The installed capacity is 55 megawatts, when we actually need about 100 megawatts. And of course, the cost of electricity in the Gambia is about 26 cents compared to about 16 cents in Mali. So whilst we make progress and we commend the government and by Mali for some of the good things that they do, we still have a lot of work as highlighted. Now, even though the Gambia has made some good strides in infrastructure and investments in roads, energy and public works, we still face a significant infrastructure deficit. Of course, aggravated by poor maintenance that holds back the economic growth and development. The NDP also identified critical investments that are required to close the infrastructure gap. Although financing is still a huge challenge and certainly beyond the Gambia government's means. The NDP's gross budget without accounting for available resources stands at about 2.4 billion. Of this, energy and infrastructure is still more than 50%. So you can understand the challenge. Again, the Director of Budget talked about the large public debt burden, notably, especially from the state-owned enterprises, leaving little room despite some improvement for the private sector. And we recognize that there has been some improvement in this regard. Unemployment rate in the Gambia is still at 35%, with the youth about 41%. And of course, a national review of skills and employability show that few people receive skill training, mostly due to unforeseen and uneven distribution of technical and vocational training institutions, mainly in the urban areas only. So promoting and training youth is critical to enhancing our employability. Now, with the opportunities also, the African Development Bank report projects real GDP growth of about 5.1% in 2020 to 2021. It's close to 6%, as our director says. So we're hopeful that it will be 6%. Of course, we are also mindful that agriculture and tourism, with increased external financing and trade boosted by the recent Trans-Gambia Bridge, would be good direction for our growth. The Gambia's location on the coast and our proximity to Europe makes it one of the most frequently visited tourist destinations, as has been highlighted already. So we also have great opportunities to increase our tourism from 20% to perhaps 25% going forward. Whilst agriculture remains a priority sector, we must invest on value addition, and that is the way forward. With regards to trade and regional integration, the Gambia can equally benefit from regional integration, especially through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which certainly will boost trade between our 1.3 billion population and hopefully raise this to about $3.4 trillion going forward. That is one of the largest regional in the world. We also have the imminent eco currency coming in, which also will reduce some differences and certainly the risks of foreign exchange losses, and can protect us against financial crisis and expansion for businesses. Plans to modernize the port of Banjul, if fully implemented, will strengthen the Gambia's position as a hub for the transit trade and can further increase its revenue. I'm pleased to share with you that as a member of the board of the GPA, we are now well over $1 billion in turnover a year, and I believe we can, with the new expansion project, easily reach $2 billion. I talked about the diaspora remittances, which has been recognized as a huge enabler of our economy. In fact, it accounts to over 20% of our GDP. having gone up from $277 million in 2018 to over $360 million in 2019. We also, as Director of Budget said, are aware of the discussions ongoing on issuance of the diaspora bonds in the Gambia. But this will also need new policies, and we trust that the Gambia government will implement accordingly. With regards to manufacturing and industrial zones, I recognize the CEO of GAITAF and TAF Africa Global, that the recent industrial zone signed between TAF and GAIPA can promote export-oriented growth and generate employment for our youth. In many countries, these zones are an important instrument of socio-economic development, widely deployed to kickstart industrial sectors and to promote technology to local economies that can contribute to improving the overall investment climate for everyone, as well as lowering transaction costs, especially for FDI activities, and increasing again the ease of doing business. So we call upon the Gambia government to work actively to support this project, as well as to perhaps promote other industrial zones all across the Gambia. Information technology and fintech. We have many youth today involved in this sector, and I witness really the boom as a positive development. This can support economic growth, reduce poverty, and strengthen financial development, inclusion, and efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just close my remarks by sharing a quote from former Prime Minister David Cameron. The economy is the start and end of everything. You can't have successful education reform or any reform if you don't have a strong economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sekda, for giving us a good insight from the GCCI's perspective. Certainly the challenges looking at delays in fiscal policies and of course government support. And you've highlighted several opportunities including GDP growth and of course trade financing and the different sectors. It has been brought to my attention that few people in the audience would like to ask some questions because they want to leave imminently. So before we bring on our last, but not the least, panelists to give their overview, I'd just like to open the floor to the people that want to ask the questions, and then we'll continue with the panelists, and then we'll go to the interactive session proper. So if we have the microphones, and the ones that want to talk, can you please raise your hands? So we have Ms. Nyanya Dabo in front. If we can have a microphone in front for Ms. Dabo, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Good morning to you all. Thank you, Bai. Thank you, Mr. Barry. Thank you, Aliu. I have two questions for Mr. Barry and Bai. And by the way, I've learned something new today. I never knew public education was free. Congratulations. Mr. Barry, my question, I went through briefly the country report, May 2019. We have seen a significant shift. By the way, I am a policy outreach and government relationship consultant at the United Nations Capital Development Fund for 7 least developed countries, 6 in Africa and in Bhutan. My question to you is the significant shift in ratio shift of budget support and projects. prior to 2016, budget support ratio was 5-1. And what we've seen now, it's the reverse. We have project 5 and support 1. Obviously, we know that means less spending power and empowerment on the side of the government. But my worry is who is really sort of monitoring these projects to ensure that the right amount of these funds are spent in the country and they would have significant impact in people's life. From little experience I have since joining the development sector 3 years ago, we've seen that funds given to these projects, most of them UN agencies, 80% are spent outside the country. So how can we have the economic improvement of livelihoods of the Gambians when 20% or at most 30% of these funds are actually spent in the Gambia? What are the reasons and what are the mechanisms that are in place to ensure there's this shift? That's my question to you. And my question to you is, you've mentioned the budget for 2020 and the highest is works. And to me as a Gambian, this is a misalignment from what this government, this transitional government, for example, should focus on. We would expect more of the social programs like you've highlighted. So I don't know what is your role as Director of Budget to support this administration in terms of prioritizing the budget and allocation to make sure that the Gambian peoples benefit more and their lives improve. These are my two questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nyanya. I believe the question goes to two panelists. The first one is for Mr. Barry. If you could kindly answer that question.
Okay, thank you, Madam. Regarding the first question on the composition of grants between budget support and project, if my recollection are fine, I think before the crisis, Gambia was not receiving budget support because of the situation in which they were, right? Now, since 2016, or after 2016, there have been more support in terms of providing budget support to the Gambia than the situation where most of the donors were outside. Because when you are in a situation where donors cannot trust the quality of the budget, providing budget support, they are more reluctant. So the mode of operation for the donors is to make sure that they control the way the project is conducted. They know where they are spending the money, so they use project rather than budget support. So I may think before 2017, you will see more project rather than budget support, and since 2017, we see more budget support coming in because EU is regularly providing budget support, and we expect that also to improve when the program is in place. As I said, you have between 150 million and 200 million that is lined up for the next 3 years that will come as a budget support. Now, regarding how to make sure that projects spend more in the country and less abroad is the nature of the country. Gambia produced less goods and services that are often used in those projects. So you expect when they hire a consultant coming from abroad that they pay the service to that person because he's not here. But I think capacity is being built. You see more, I think even the GPPA Act, the new GPPA Act, has some provisions that every contract includes some of, a portion of domestic input into it. So make sure that they collaborate with the domestic companies so part of the money stays. But given the nature of the country, the type of services that are here, it is difficult to see that happen in a very short period. But I think it's a collective effort that both the government in terms of providing, facilitating the build-up of that capacity in the private sector, but also the private sector being formalized and engaged and participating into any bid that donors are providing in order, because if you don't participate to a bid, your chance of getting it is less. So I will advise the private sector to work better and better to see how they could fit into the donors' requirements in terms of access into the project that they are financing on the ground. So that's the two points that I want to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barry, for answering those questions. The next question is for Baimadi Sise, the Director of Budget.
Thank you very much, Nyanya. I would respectfully have to differ with your opinion that it's misaligned to invest in or to prioritize infrastructure, because you also have to look at the ripple effect of having good infrastructure in terms of having the ability to move goods and services in a timely basis that can easily boost economic activity. So I think in any government that you go, any country you go, one of the founding pillars is having a good infrastructure so the goods and services can be moved in a timely manner in order to boost economic activity. And second point is, in fact, most of these, the Minister of Works budget, this 4.1 billion, about 70 to 80% of it is associated with two main projects. One of them is about the Chinese projects in terms of construction of roads and bridges around the Basse, Fatoto, and Koina N. And the other big project is to do with the OIC project. We also received some monies from the IDB and Badia to also enhance the road network in the Gambia and also to improve the airport as well too. So the bulk of this 4.1 billion is associated with these two projects. And finally, also my role in the budget is mainly to coordinate and also give advice based on sound technical analysis to the minister. But the authority who has the biggest say in the budget, what is in the budget, is not me. It's at cabinet, and most important is at parliament. Parliament, they have the final say. So even whatever I propose, parliament can change, even cabinet can change it. So they have the final say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Mr. Mustafa Njaya as well wanting to ask a question. Would you please pass?
Thank you. Thank you. For organizing this. And say further the CEO and the very soon. Now, I think more very I'm glad that
IMF.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that the main economy is social and evidence between 2020 and beyond. That's the opportunity for us. But I want to highlight the challenges. The challenges, you want to do this, your skills are very low. And what we have seen in other countries is that as having these skills now, already is a very good country. The skills that are being imported to this country to basic things like construction. So this is a major challenge. And in order to mitigate this, I want to advise the government rules and conditions. We have 16,000 youth that are going out of our lower basic who are more or less assured. So government needs to move fast to train people with skills in order to do this. Just like Mr. Sega advised, we are now involved in the export of the airport. Our main challenge is the availability of skills. That's advice that government should be able to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jai. That's a very good advice coming from a very prominent gentleman who's contributed a lot to the Gambian economy.
But I would like to give the floor back to Ms. Ashraf to quickly give her overview as well. She's the economist, country economist for the World Bank. I'll pass the floor on to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. First, let me thank you all for being here, for getting me here and as part of an esteemed panel. Thanks to the Standard Bank for I feel a little bit left out when I was at the end of the panel, but I completely understand that it's unintentional, but just to throw that out. There has been discussion and a little bit on the opportunities. Let me focus on the opportunities first, and then we can talk about the challenges, and I'll get economic outlook at the end, because it's largely in line with what the economist of the SCB presented. Bank is also projecting a similar kind of growth, but that was probably 2 weeks ago when this coronavirus hasn't hit that badly across the globe, and we would need to see how it would impact the Gambia, given Gambia is largely exposed to exogenous shocks, almost all of it of economic growth, be it tourism or agriculture, and I'll get to that in a bit. In terms of the opportunities, as Bai has presented the crux of the budget 2020, it's primarily based on creating additional fiscal space. And someone also discussed a little bit about inclusive growth, and that's where the key is. The fiscal space that needs to be created out of all the unproductive spending that has been the hallmark in this country needs to be channeled into priority infrastructure and human capital investments so that the growth can be sustainable and inclusive. Bai talks about the social safety net program. We are a partner to the government there as World Bank. We're helping them to roll out cash transfer programs to the most vulnerable and poor across the globe. There are also initiatives to roll out a national health insurance scheme. Its relevance can't be more emphasized in the current scenario of this coronavirus attack. I think it's a little bit of a late start, but we haven't missed the bus, and we can get there quickly. Let me also turn a little bit on the structural reforms, but just before that, transparency has been improving in this country. I'm not sure if you are aware, but the government has been very open in terms of disseminating, at least from the economic side, the fiscal and debt transparency information out there to the public. That helps improve accountability and policy making. Budget 2020 is an example. It's out on the website. You can see all the allocations that are being made to the ministries, the MDAs. So that's a very positive sign. That's something coming out of the legacy that the country has been in. It's something to celebrate and to take further. I would also like to highlight the key reforms the government has undertaken over the last 2 years and is currently undertaking as well, primarily related to the SOEs. We all know in the past the rule that was there till 2017, there had been a lot of mismanagement on the SOE sector. The government is moving fast on the agenda, and it's a multi-pronged agenda. It's not just about thinking in terms of how to improve the corporate governance and internal control and financial reporting of the SOEs, but also to kind of clear the past arrears and all the errors that were there, to move ahead with a clean slate, and then also to think through on a strategy to prevent those areas to accumulate again. I would like to quote an example there. The NOVIX strive to basically convert all the public sector customers to a prepaid metering is one example that would help allow a government to break from this past of cross-arrear accumulation time and again. A new SOE law has also been drafted, which is basically allowing to limit the executive interference in these SOEs that was a hallmark before, and also improving the governance of the board, which are governing these SOEs, and improving the central is pending approval right now, primarily because we all know the new constitution is in the phase right now, and as soon as it's implemented, the new law would be promulgated, and that would inform further reforms on the SOE sector. Key is to move fast on finalizing the constitution and getting it passed through all the next steps in order for us to help the government, and the government also to move ahead with a lot of secondary legislations that need to be then revised as per the new constitution. I would also like to commend government's efforts in improving the framework, the legislative framework for public procurement. You heard both from Barry and by the new Public Procurement Act. It has been a significant move in terms of limiting the use of single source procurement to very tightly defined emergency situations only, improving the ambit of the Gambia Public Procurement Authority to cover all agencies that are procuring public funds, and also limiting the executive waivers that were witnessed in the recent past. So going forward, the government seems committed to improve the efficiency of public procurement in terms of not only the legislative reform that I just mentioned, but also they are working with us closely in terms of rolling out an e-procurement module for the government. It will be a pilot phase in the first, as the first step, but then we will see how we can upscale. There I would like to also emphasize the enabling environment that needs to be in place from the digital economy perspective in order for the government to be more transparent, and in order to also plug in some of the leakages that happen through human interaction. For that matter, digital economy is the new need of the hour, and we all need to join hands there to help the government move ahead. Just quickly also mentioning the public investment reforms that the government is doing. The Gambia Strategic Review Board is in place, and they are also thinking about expanding the mandate of the board to select and appraise all the public infrastructure projects that go through the budget and also come from the donor side. There's a need there to move fast with having a clear and transparent project selection criteria that would help improve the efficiency of public investment as well. So these are some of the very good, bold reforms that are happening at the government side. Now just turning to the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, this country is exposed to a lot of exogenous shocks, be it agriculture or tourism. So the government and climate change, because agriculture and climate change is linked. You have a rain-fed agriculture, agrarian economy, and the irrigation systems are not well developed. So in terms of moving ahead, the government needs to really prioritize on this primary sector. It will not only help the economic growth to be more sustainable, it will be inclusive, because agriculture is largely the livelihood of rural population and where most of the poor dwell. In terms of tourism, there is a need to diversify away from the current modes of tourism, because there is a huge potential that this country offers, but somehow the potential is not being unveiled. And as soon as something happens like a coronavirus outbreak, we could see that there is a general travel scare and people would go away. So in that sense, how the government could mitigate that kind of a shock. We saw in 2015-16 the magnitude of loss that was inflicted by the Ebola crisis, even though there was not a single case in the Gambia, but it was just the perception of it being in the Africa, and the Africa as a whole being hit by that calamity went a long way in inflicting losses to the economy. So there is a need to think through on how we can strengthen the real sector in such kind of a scenario, shock scenario. Also, it's important to stay vigilant, and there has been a lot of discussion around sustainability from this side of the panel and also from the presenter. But it's important that the caution needs to be there in terms of what we are entering into as a government on borrowing. Because Gambia has gone through a long process in terms of restoring that sustainability, and it's important it's preserved. Another important aspect that needs to be looked into, and and a lot of you alluded to that, is the skill gap. It's important, and its connection with the human capital. Gambia has signed up for the Human Capital Index project of the World Bank, and it's important that a lot of meaningful investment is made into health, education, and social protection, but not just there, also to improve the female labor force participation in order for the Gambia to reap the benefits of being an early adopter of HCI, and also to improve the skill gap that's there and that's not allowing enough job creation to serve the public of this country. With that, I'll close, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ashraf. That was a good contribution, and you certainly highlighted on the improvement of transparency with the government, which is a good news. And of course, the challenges with tourism, diversity of the tourism sector is quite important. Sustainability and skills, all these are quite important. And I'm sure we'll have some questions. I've already had some hands being raised, so now we'll actually go to the interactive session. I have Mr. Nyang Jai, and I also have Dr. Sala as well, who already raised their hands. So if we can pass the microphone to Mr. Jai for his questions, please.
Good morning, thank you so much. I think it was a very elaborate presentation, and I have 3 questions. One is to the presenter, the other one is to the gentleman from the IMF, and Mr. Cisse. The presenter spoke about inflation, not only globally, but within the local context. And I think given the coronavirus and also the correction by GRA, inflation in 2020 will change drastically. Why? And I am a gentleman alluded to the efforts made by GRA to improve correction. But it's not about efficiency. The improvement has nothing to do with efficiency. It has everything to do with evaluation techniques. They have changed the manner in which they do their evaluations from the past. And who's going to pay for this? The average Ghanaian consumer. Who's going to pay for this? The economy. Why? Inflation will creep. And when inflation creeps, this social inclusion that we've been talking about will be zero-sum and society will not benefit. So the issue of GRA needs to be revisited, and the revisit is not about how much is collected, but how is it collected. 1. Number 2, on your inflation figures. I believe the Ghanaian inflation figures on December 2020 will rise faster than we're seeing. Why? Gambia's great asset is Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, even in India, has just gone through a standstill, and I can keep that. It will affect commodities coming our way. And once this commodities come here, price levels will change. So we need to be mindful of that. Ministry of Finance and the gentleman, you also are to make sure that your payment thresholds are sustainable. There's one thing taking a shower and another thing running back to the sun and burying yourself. A week or 2 ago, I am at Gambia, and the AMR press release spoke about an ECF of about 48, and we reported that it's great. But what we outside looking in and I'm happy with is the government of the Gambia contracting new debt. Thereby, the space has already been cleared up, and we are hoping it will improve expenditures post-2020. Now, they're contracting new debt in excess of $80 to $100 million with EPAD and others. I don't think that's helping the Gambia, and social inclusion, once again, that we're talking about, it's not happening. So we need to be very responsible and also our political expediency in fiscal decisions. If not, we will go back to fiscal governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Njai. So your first question goes to Mr. Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Njai. Very interesting question. I will say, it's true that recently there have been some adjustment of the way of the value trade. And that is the requirement, I think, worldwide. It's just before the way the value was to have administrative prices that they use to value import. But they are moving to a system whereby your invoice that you will bring from your supplier will determine how much you have to pay. So if you bring a proper invoice, that invoice will be used in order to do the valuation. I think that is what international standards recommend, and the GRA is progressively moving to that. I'm sure at the beginning, before the private sector gets used to that new system, it clears some friction, because even I guess the custom agents that are applying those techniques are not sufficiently trained to do so. So we expect to see that. But I will say efficiency increased significantly at GRA level, at least for what we see during last year, and we expect that also to continue. I will give you an example. They did some audit of the telecom sector. The telecom sector contribution was very little in terms of tax collection in the past. But last year, they had some technical support from our technical assistance center in Ghana. They did some audit of those companies. The companies corrected automatically, knowing that now GRA is going in deep in terms of looking at the balance sheet and knowing exactly what they should contribute. The declaration of those companies improved by 35%. So it was a significant improvement because of knowing that GRA have now the knowledge of how to assess their declaration that they were doing to the GRA. So that is an improvement. I will add there is currently 3.5, around 3.5% of tax exemptions in the Gambia, which is huge. If you have that 3.4 and invest that into rural area education and health, I think what you can achieve in terms of inclusion and reduction of poverty in rural area will be huge compared to the increase in price that taxing rightly the product that is coming to this country will have on the prices. So there is a balance, whether you want more of the social effort that the government is doing be implemented rightly, or you want to have a tax break that will benefit a part of the population and have a budget that will not address the social need of the country. So there is that trade-off that needs to be done, and I think it's important that we all be aware of what is happening and describe it as such rather than trying to downplay the efforts that the GRA is doing in terms of improving the way tax is paid in this country. I think that was the question I was asked. The rest I have comment, but I will leave my colleague to respond.
Yeah, I think you've answered that question. I think there was a question for our economist as well, maybe quickly, and then we do have quite a few hands up. We have Dr. Sala, we have Abdullah Ejane, and Dr. Jones as well.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you for doing that explanation prior. I was also looking for 4 hours of the long stay. You got the demand for 4 hours of stay. I have a great say. Again, you got how export expectations there, so there shouldn't be much time. I know the price is very important for the conference. Very important last week. I think that was a passion for
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that answer. Let's pass the mic on now to Dr. Sala, please. One moment.
On the debt, you highlight the debt. I think what was in the press on this IFAD loan was the scope of the project rather than the debt that was actually contracted. The portion of debt that was contracted is very low compared to the amount. They talked about 100 million on that road project. What is contracted is 4 million as a debt. The rest is grants. France is providing grant. So sometime also you need to dig into those information to make sure that what is communicated. Myself, when I saw that, I was shocked. But after I saw the fact, I realized that the debt component was very low. Actually, the grant is a large component on that project.
Thank you, Mr. Barry. Dr. Sala?
Good morning, Mr. Board. First and foremost, I want to congratulate the presenters for very good presentation. This is the Almighty intelligence to come to our people begin to forget the importance of health and healthcare in the economy is something that we need to solve. And the coronavirus is one of them. What worries me about such outbreaks is very limited capacity in our country after over 50 years of independence in terms of diagnosing and managing diseases, especially related disease outbreaks. It goes without saying that a lot of this is desired and we still have a whole world. I think government in particular looking for more resources, not only for preventive care, but also for preventive care. But even the private sector has a role to play because health sciences institutions are poorly capacitated in terms of because typically they will perform long-term practice to be sustained, but the poor so any form of non-memory and the therapy is I'm happy that the government is increasing resources and the national health insurance scheme is having highlighted but there's still some under-development. First and foremost, everyone would like to know how that scheme is going to be funded. Secondly, if funds are identified by government or organizing the economy, how can we ensure that the budgeted funds are strictly seated to the national insurance scheme and not as what everybody happens? The funds are acquired to other areas and it is going to
large chunk of money that the government controls. Currently, the issue of management of service scheme, experience in Scotland and beyond has clearly shown that service scheme is very prone to mismanagement and corruption, and also politically. So what pre-government measures are being put in place to make sure that we do not suffer from that? Because the issue is very important thing, it's a precaution. So as the master said, like the economic progress is economic progress. For the rightful eye, you will see that there is a preponderance of foreign influence. It clearly shows that very little is being on capacity tax, local players, to make, to the necessary participation and make the necessary contribution to our economy. I mean, it goes without saying that it's important that America a lot of people to send back to strengthen the economies of the countries of America. And at the end of the day, what we want to approve to the Gambian economy will not happen. But I'm trying to say, maybe government will be able to put it in place, some form of water system, some form of irrigation system, so that they have the right amount of indigenized local players. And which means, remember the capacity people who are willing and able to make contributions and
Thank you very much, Dr. Sala. I guess by Madisise can take that question.
Thank you, Doctor. Maybe I'll just address the issue of the National Health Insurance Scheme, because my sitting here as a budget director, I can only dwell upon fiscal policy issues, not all government-related issues. For the National Health Insurance, all I can say is that there's a technical committee currently comprising the Minister of Health, the private sector, the insurance companies, and also the Ministry of Finance. Unfortunately, I'm not part of the committee, so I cannot maybe elaborate all the mechanism that they have in place in order to operationalize this national health insurance. But you raise a good point about how can we ascertain that these funds will not be viant in the future. That is a very valid point. And what I can say is that it is highly unlikely that these funds will be viant into other areas. And maybe just to quickly address the point that was raised on the debt issue, I think let me also highlight one thing about debt. Yes, it can be unproductive if you accumulate debt. But the key thing about debt is how are you utilizing those resources? That is the key thing. If I take debt and I use it for consumption, then that is problematic, very, very problematic. But if I incur debt and I invest it in an area whereby the returns will be more than my debt service, then it's not very problematic. It's actually sustainable. So we have to, I just wanted to make that distinction, that it depends on how you utilizing this actual debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sisi. Before I move on to the next gentleman to ask a question, can I please plead with the audience, if we can ask the direct questions in the interest of time, perhaps if we're making a comment, to make it just brief so that everybody can ask their questions. So if I can go to Dr. Jones and then to Mr. Jane, please. Can we pass the mic on to Dr. Jones?
Yes, good morning. Thank you. Mine is a brief one, and we spent a while reflecting on what I'd call operational matters in terms of the economy. Last year, 2 years ago, this year, next year. I would like us to reflect on our economic history and the implications of that. That is the long term. If we look at the economic history of the Gambia, going back from the 70s onwards, it has been a boom and bust cycle. we have been locked into an area where the per capita income of this country is relentlessly low income, and there's no evidence that we're going to break into middle income anytime soon. So that tells us one thing: we're doing something wrong. I've heard of IMF programs in the past. I've been here long enough to be through several IMF programs, right, and several government attempts to restructure things, and all of them have failed. What we have got, and I'll say this, is that the type of people who attempt the Gambia economic outlook over the last 30 years or so have benefited tremendously and are doing very well in the country. But the per capita income of the country remains poor, and the average man outside has seen very little benefit from the last 30 years. So we need to have a paradigm shift. If we're to take this country into middle income status, we need to have a paradigm shift and do something very, very different. Because what I'm hearing so far today is more of the same. And one small thing as well, when we're thinking about paradigm shifts, it must be evidence-based. There is no evidence that quotas for local investors so that somehow they can get more of a share of the economy when there's no skill available locally. There's no evidence that that works. We've seen it in South Africa with black economic empowerment. It led to a few people becoming billionaires and the masses remaining poor. So what we need to do is to increase the general skills level, as staff has said before, so that local nationals can actually sustainably compete and provide the services and goods required. But any short fix doesn't work. All it does is benefit a few at the expense of the many. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, for that excellent contribution. We'll take that as a comment and a contribution. Thank you. So we'll now pass the mic on to Abdullah Abe Jane. He has a question and possibly a brief comment.
Thank you, Tafa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abdullah Jane. I'm the economist at UNDP. So I just wanted to thank Standard Chartered Bank for inviting us to this event today. Congratulations to my brother Kale on your promotion. It's bittersweet that you're leaving, but you can hold your head up high that you're leaving for bigger and better things. And for the panel, congratulations for your very fruitful and informative discussions here, my friends and colleagues over there. I always want to be here every year for the discussions. It's very, very informative on what's taking place in the Gambia here. I wanted to double down on what the Director of Budget, Baimadi, was talking about in terms of economic growth. Economic growth, Gambia has been growing moderately, let's say about 5 to 6% in the past few years, which is a very laudable achievement for the government, given where we're coming from with very low and volatile growth of 2 to 3%. So this is an achievement in itself. However, like you were saying, this growth is not inclusive. The latest IHS showed that 48%, that's nearly half of the population, live below the poverty line. And it's even worse when you look at the rural areas, where it's 69, almost 70% of the population that live below the poverty line. There could be no meaningful development in this country if these people in the rural areas are continuously being left behind on this development journey of the country. That's why I think we should also laud the government for starting this program for accelerated community development, this PACD, which is a rural development model that's been done in other West African countries, namely Senegal and Togo, and now is being replicated here in the Gambia with support from UNDP as well. And this is aimed at providing basic services, road infrastructure, energy, water, and agricultural services to the most poor and vulnerable. It's in the pilot phase now, and the government have taken it upon themselves to fund the process so far to the tune of $250 million. But we can't leave it for government alone to implement. In this, we have 10 years between now and 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which are aligned to the National Development Plan and subsequent development plans that will be here for the Gambia. So in order to achieve these sustainable development objectives, we can't have business as usual, and the private sector have a key role to play in ensuring the development of this country. So I implore you to support the government in this process. If you're skeptical, give it a year and see how the pilot goes. But support the rural Gambia, and that is what will be key to development in this country. Now, I have a question for you as well, Baimadi. The National Development Plan. About 2 years ago, we went to a resource mobilization conference in Brussels to mobilize resources for the NDP. So far, about 10% of this $1.8 billion that was pledged at the conference has been dispersed in the country to support national development objectives. What measures are the government taking to ensure that more of the resources are being mobilized to come into the country and support the national development planning process? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jane, for your contribution. Mr. Cisse, if you can take that question on.
Thank you, Mr. Jane. On your question, I believe the 10%, so far what we've mobilized as of end 2018 is about 180 million. For as of end 2019, I believe the numbers are being tabulated. But maybe two things. What government is doing, government is continuously engaging our development partners to fulfill what they promised us. But you also have to bear in mind that anytime you go for a resource mobilization conference, normally it's almost impossible to even attain 60% of what was pledged. It's almost impossible. Anywhere you go, donors can pledge, but at the end of the day, getting that resources is another thing. So even if you attain 50%, consider yourself very, very successful. But nevertheless, we've been continuously engaging our development partners in order to make sure that they fulfill what they promised to us.
Thank you, Mr. Cisse. Do we have any more questions? These are the key policy stakeholders in the economy, and this is your chance to ask the questions you need to ask. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, I guess we don't have any questions. Panelists, do you want to give your last words before we close? Anyone wants to mention anything? Mr. Seka, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to revert on the issue of support to local entrepreneurs, or what we call local content. By far, the Gambia Chamber of Commerce does not advocate for nationalization. To the contrary. But there's certainly a need to capacitize local entrepreneurs. Because most often, the entrepreneurs that come from elsewhere come with much cheaper finance, very often in single digit, and most regrettably, many government officials would rather support and collect kickbacks from these foreigners. That must be dealt with. That was the point.
Thank you, Mr. Seka. So I would like to now call upon our chairman, Mr. Alpha Barry, to deliver the closing remarks. If we can have a microphone for him, you can either stand by the podium, or if you wish, you can just face the audience. It's up to you.
I know Mr. Barry, I think maybe
Closing remarks. We can now have a photo session here on top. And once again, thank you very much for your contribution and your attendance. Thank you for the audience for being